She poured their wine for 2 years, and not one of them ever looked at her face. They saw the tray. They saw the uniform. They saw a girl who refilled their glasses and cleared their plates, and apologized when their elbows knocked the silver. A girl so far beneath them she might as well have been part of the furniture. So on the night, one of the richest men in the city threw a full glass of red wine across her chest and laughed in her face. The entire room laughed with him. 300 people in diamonds and black tie laughing at the help. They had no idea what they were laughing at, because the most dangerous man in that room was about to set down his glass, rise from his chair, cross the floor in the dead silence, wipe the wine from her cheek with his own hand, and say 5 quiet words that would end careers, empires, and lives. You just humiliated my wife. Welcome back to The Overlooked Woman, the channel where the women the world ignored become the women it can never forget. If you love dark romance, dangerous men with one single soft place buried in their hearts, and that slow, delicious moment when everyone who looked down on her finally understands exactly who they were dealing with, then you are in exactly the right place tonight. So pour yourself a drink, turn the lights down low, get comfortable. Tonight's story is called The Wife They Never Saw Coming, and it begins like all the best ones do, with a woman everyone underestimated and a single glass of wine. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Wine. The wine came at her like it had been thrown by the hand of God. 1 second she was standing at the edge of the ballroom with a silver tray balanced on her palm, invisible the way the help is always invisible, and the next, a full glass of Bordeaux was arcing through the chandelier light and breaking against her collarbone. It soaked through the white of her blouse in an instant, spreading down across her chest like something had been opened inside her. The crystal glass hit the marble and shattered. The sound was very small in a room that large. And then the laughter started. It began with one man, broad, silver-haired, expensively pleased with himself, and it moved outward through the gala like a current table by table, until 100 of the wealthiest people in Chicago were turning to look at the girl, standing alone in a puddle of red. Her tray, still impossibly level, in her hand, her chin slowly lifting. "Clumsy thing," the silver-haired man said loud enough for the room. "They really will hire anyone for these things now." He plucked a napkin from a passing tray and tossed it at her feet without looking. "Clean that up before someone slips." Nora Hale did not move. She had learned in 2 years of being no one exactly how to hold a face like a closed door. She had practiced it in mirrors until it was the only expression she had left. So she stood there with the wine cooling against her skin and the laughter washing over her, and she let her eyes do the one thing they were not supposed to do. She let them find the man who had thrown the glass, and she looked at him, really looked, the way a person looks at a thing they have been hunting for a very long time. Victor Crane did not notice. Men like Victor Crane never noticed the people they hurt, but someone else did. At the far end of the room at a table no one approached without being summoned, a man set down his glass with a quiet click and stood. He did not hurry. That was the first thing the room registered, that he was not hurrying, and that the not hurrying was somehow worse than if he had come running. He crossed the ballroom floor through the spilled light and the dying laughter, and one by one the guests went silent because they knew his face. Because everyone in that city knew his face, and you did not laugh in front of Damiano Ricci. He stopped in front of her. He was very tall and very still in a tuxedo so black it seemed to drink the light, and for a moment he simply looked down at the wine, soaking her blouse with an expression she could not read at all. Then he reached up, took the linen handkerchief from his breast pocket, and gently, almost unbearably gently, wiped the wine from her cheek where it had splashed. His hand was warm. She had not expected that. "Are you hurt?" he said. It was not a question. It was a thing he was deciding. "No," she said. He folded the stained handkerchief once slowly and turned to face the room, and when he spoke, his voice did not rise at all. It did not have to. "You just humiliated my wife." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. It pressed down on the chandeliers. It pressed down on Victor Crane, whose pleased red face had gone the color of paper. It pressed down on 100 people who had laughed 30 seconds earlier and now could not remember how their own throats worked. Nora stood very still in her ruined blouse and let the word land on the room like a verdict. Wife. No one had known. That had been the entire point. Chapter 2. The Arrangement. They did not speak in the car. The Maybach pulled away from the museum into the wet Chicago night, the city smearing past in long ribbons of gold and red. And Damiano sat across from her in the dark with his jaw set and his eyes on the rain. Nora kept the ruined handkerchief in her lap. She did not know why. She kept turning it over in her fingers, the wine going brown at the edges, and she could feel him watching the small motion the way he watched. Everything. Like it was a tell, like she was a hand of cards he had not finished reading. "You didn't flinch," he said at last. The rain ticked against the glass. "A man humiliated you in front of 300 people," he went on quietly, "and threw a glass at you hard enough to bruise, and you stood there with your tray level and you looked at him. Most people cry. Most people run. You looked at him like you were measuring him for a coffin." He turned his head and the streetlights moved across the hard planes of his face. "Why, you're the one who stood up," she said. "Maybe you should explain yourself first." For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, surprise, maybe that the help had teeth. Then it was gone, smoothed back under the cold. "You're my wife," he said. "When someone strikes my wife, I respond." That's not complicated, but it was. They both knew it was. Because their marriage was 4 months old and had never once felt like a marriage. It had been an arrangement signed in a lawyer's office on the worst night of his life. The night his uncle Tommaso, the man who had raised him out of nothing, the last living person he loved, had taken his hand from a hospital bed and made a dying man's demand. "Marry. Settle. Give me one ordinary thing to be proud of before I go." And there had been a second reason underneath the first. A strategic one, the only kind Damiano truly understood. A marriage stabilized the family, sealed a truce with a rival house, closed 100 doors that ambitious men would otherwise have tried to walk through. So he had married a quiet woman a matchmaker had brought to him. A woman with a thin file and a thinner past. A woman named Nora, with steady hands and a closed-door face, who asked for nothing and revealed less, who had moved into his penthouse and slept in a separate room and spoken to him only when spoken to. He had been married to her for 4 months, and tonight, watching her face a man twice her size without blinking, he had realized he did not know her at all. It bothered him more than it should have. "You'll move into the main suite tomorrow," he said abruptly as the car turned toward the tower. "The arrangement of separate rooms is over. After tonight, the city believes we are married. They will watch. We will give them nothing to watch. And if I say no, you won't." She looked at him then fully, and he had the strange and unfamiliar sensation of being seen all the way to the back. "You stood up for me," she said, "and I'm grateful. But understand something, Mr. Ricci. I am not afraid of you. People keep expecting me to be. It would save us both time if you didn't." The car stopped. The door opened to rain, and Damiano Ricci sat for a moment in the dark, watching his wife walk into the storm without an umbrella. Her ruined blouse going translucent in the downpour, her spine perfectly straight, and felt for the first time in years the dangerous, electric pull of curiosity. He should have been more afraid of it. Curiosity in his world was how men died. The first test of the new arrangement came 4 days later, at a dinner she could not refuse. It was held in a private room above a restaurant that did not take reservations from anyone whose name Damiano did not personally approve. A long candlelit table, a dozen of the city's quietest power brokers and their wives, the kind of room where the real business of Chicago was done in the spaces between sentences. Damiano had told her almost nothing on the way over. Smile when they look at you. Say little. Let them wonder. But she had understood the thing underneath the instruction. This was a stage, and the city had bought tickets, and the play they had come to see was whether the cold and dangerous Damiano Ricci had truly married, or whether the wife was rumor he could be talked out of. She gave them a marriage. She had spent 2 years learning to read rooms from their edges, and now she read this one from its center, which fork the eldest woman used, which man laughed, a half-second too late, which wife watched Damiano's hands. And when a banker 3 seats down leaned across the candles and asked her with a smile like a knife wrapped in silk, where exactly a man like Ricci had found a woman like her, Nora set down her glass and smiled back and said, "He didn't find me. I let him think he did." And the whole table laughed. And Damiano, who had been mid-sentence with the man on his left, went very still and turned to look at her with an expression that was almost a smile. It was the banker's wife who nearly undid her. She was beautiful in the cold, expensive way of women who have never once been invisible. And she had known Damiano a long time, and she leaned into him over the dessert with a familiarity that was its own small announcement, her hand resting on his sleeve, her voice pitched low and intimate, and meant to be overheard. Nora watched the hand on her husband's arm and felt something move in her chest, that she had not budgeted for something hot and territorial and entirely beneath her, and she despised it. And she could not make it stop. Damiano felt her watching. Of course he did. He felt everything. He did not pull his arm away from the woman. He did something worse, something deliberate, something Nora understood was aimed at her like a slow arrow. He reached across the table without looking, took his wife's hand from where it rested on the linen, and laced his fingers through hers in full view of the room, and held it there on the white cloth between the candles for the rest of the night. The banker's wife withdrew her hand. The table noticed. The play had been performed. In the car afterward in the dark, neither of them let go. "You were jealous," he said. He sounded almost wondering. "You're imagining it." "I never imagine anything," Damiano said, and lifted their joined hands and looked at them in the passing light as though they belonged to two other people. It was useful. The room saw it. They'll talk. A pause longer than it needed to be. But it wasn't a performance, was it? Not all of it. She looked out the window at the rain. She did not answer him. She did not have to. He kept her hand the whole way home, and neither of them said another word, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It had become the other kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that is full of everything. Two people have decided not to say yet. Chapter 3. The Dying Man. The hospital was not a hospital. It was the top floor of one bought outright, the kind of place where the machines were silent and the flowers were changed twice a day, and no name appeared on any chart. Tommaso Ricci was dying in it, and no one knew why. Nora went with Damiano on the third morning of their new arrangement because a wife went because the city was watching, and she stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the old man who had been emperor of half of Chicago's shadows, and was now a gray and shrinking thing tangled in tubes, and something in her went very cold and very still. She knew this. She knew the waxy color of his skin. She knew the particular tremor in his left hand, the way the fingers curled, the slight droop on one side of the mouth that the doctors were calling a series of small strokes. She knew the smell, faint and sweetish under the antiseptic. She had spent her childhood in the back rooms of her father's compounding pharmacy, grinding and measuring and reading toxicology reports for fun, the way other children read comics. And she had spent her 20s in a research lab before her whole life had been set on fire, and she knew, looking at Tommaso Ricci, that this man was not dying of strokes. This man was being poisoned, slowly, expertly, by someone with access and patience, and a very particular kind of knowledge. She kept her face a closed door. "The doctors are the best in the country," Damiano said. He was standing very close to her, closer than the watching required, his voice low. "They've run everything. They find nothing. They tell me he is simply old, simply failing." A muscle moved in his jaw. "He is 61. He swam a mile every morning until February." "What happened in February?" Nora asked. "Crane Pharmaceutical proposed a partnership," Damiano said. Tommaso refused it, said the man smelled wrong. He looked at his uncle's gray face. 2 weeks later, he had his first stroke. Nora's pulse moved once hard against the inside of her wrist. Crane. She had built 2 years of her life out of patience. She had learned to wait the way stone waits, so she did not let it show on her face, not the recognition, not the old grief rising up her throat like flood water, not the cold, clean rage that had been sitting in her chest since she was 23 years old and had watched her father walk into a courtroom, an honest man, and walk out a monster the newspapers had invented. Victor Crane had built an empire on a class of compounds that did exactly this, that mimicked natural decline, that hid inside the body's own failures, that killed slowly enough to look like time. He had used one of them 8 years ago to taint a batch of medication and let 3 patients die. And then he had needed a name to nail it to a small, honest pharmacist whose lab had filled the prescriptions, a man too unimportant to fight a billionaire. And he had chosen Samuel Hale. Her father had hanged himself in a holding cell rather than let the trial drag his daughters through the mud. The newspapers had called it a confession. It was not a confession. It was the last gift a ruined man could give the children he loved. And Victor Crane had walked away from it cleaner than ever, richer than ever. And 8 years later, he was poisoning an old man on the top floor of a private hospital. Nora Hale was standing close enough to the truth to taste it. She did the hardest thing she had ever done. She said nothing, because the moment she revealed what she knew, she revealed what she was. And a chemist who could read a poisoning at a glance was not a quiet, blank, unimportant wife. She would become a question Damiano Ricci could not stop asking, and she was not ready yet to be a question. So she only said softly, "I'm sorry. He raised you. He found me in a stairwell," Damiano said, "when I was 9, and he did not look away. And then, as if the words had cost him something he had not meant to spend, he turned and left the room. Behind him, Nora looked at the dying man one more time and made him a promise with her eyes. It was the second promise she had made with her eyes that week. The first had been to the man who threw the wine. She intended to keep them both. She nearly broke the first one in the elevator. She had stepped out of Tommaso's room to compose herself, and the private elevator had opened, and Victor Crane had walked out of it, carrying a spray of white orchids, and an arrangement of grief so practiced it could have been notarized. He was here, of course. He was here, the considerate business rival, the magnanimous, almost partner, paying his respects to the man he was murdering by inches. He did not see Nora at first. He was rehearsing his face in the dark glass of the elevator doors. Then he turned, and for one suspended second, they were alone in the corridor 2 feet apart, and Victor Crane looked directly at Eleanor Hale for the first time in 8 years. She watched him not recognize her. That was the thing that nearly broke her. Not his cruelty, not his nerve, but the sheer ordinariness of his failure to know her, the way she was so far beneath his memory that the daughter of the man he had hanged could stand close enough to touch him and register as nothing more than staff. His eyes moved over her grey dress, found her unimportant, moved on. "They're keeping the family comfortable, I hope," he said, the way you'd speak to a nurse. Such a tragedy. Such a strong old man. You never expect it of the strong ones. "No," Nora said. Her voice was perfectly steady. 2 years of stone. You never do. He smiled at her, a warm, empty, public smile, and carried his white orchids down the hall toward the room where his poison was failing. And Nora stood in the corridor with her hands folded and her face a closed door, and let him pass within. Inches of the knife she was becoming, because the time was not yet, because the time would be a room of his own choosing, and 500 witnesses, and not 1 second sooner. When the elevator doors had closed behind her, and she was alone, she allowed her hands just briefly to shake. Then she stopped them, and went back inside and got to work. Chapter 4. The photographs. She found the room 2 nights later. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for the source of a draft, a cold seam of air in the penthouse that ran along the western wall of his study, and her hand had found the edge of a panel that was not quite a wall, and the panel had swung inward on a hinge she could feel, but not see, and then she was standing in a narrow, dark room she had not known existed, and the motion light came on and she stopped breathing. The walls were covered in her photographs, dozens of them. Hundreds. Nora at the gala. Nora at the market on Tuesdays. Nora 3 years younger, with darker hair before the dye, before the name. Nora, at 24, standing outside a courthouse in a black coat, and her heart slammed sideways because that photograph was from before the marriage, from before the matchmaker, from a life that was supposed to be buried. So deep no one could find it. He had been watching her, not for 4 months, for longer. There was a corkboard with a single name pinned to the center of it, and the name was not Nora. It was Eleanor Hale. "I wondered," Damiano said from the doorway, "how long it would take you to find this." She did not turn around. She made herself breathe. She made her hands stop. 2 years of stone. "You've been watching me," she said. "I watch everyone I sleep 1 wall away from." His voice was very calm, very cold, the voice he used on men who were about to disappear. "I had you investigated before I married you." The file came back clean. Too clean. A woman with no debt, no family, no history before 3 years ago. That is not a woman, that is a story someone wrote. He stepped into the room and the photographs of her face surrounded them both. So I kept looking. And 6 weeks ago, a contact of mine in records pulled a thread, and the thread had a name on it, and the name was Eleanor Hale, daughter of Samuel Hale, the pharmacist who killed 3 people and hanged himself in 2018. A pause. "Except your father didn't kill anyone, did he?" She turned around. For the first time in 2 years, she let the closed door of her face come open just a crack, just enough. And she watched the most dangerous man in Chicago see her grief and her rage, and the long, terrible patience of her all at once. "No," she said, "he didn't. Tell me Damiano said that you did not marry me to get to Victor Crane." The lie was right there. She could have taken it. She was good at lies. She had been living inside one for 2 years, but she was tired suddenly, in a way she had not let herself be, and the photographs of her own face were watching her, and the man in front of her had stood up in a ballroom and wiped wine from her cheek, and she found she did not want to lie to him anymore. "I can't tell you that," she said. The silence in the little room was absolute. "You arranged it. Damiano said slowly, and she watched the understanding arrive in him like a slow wound. The matchmaker, the truce, the convenient quiet woman with no past, delivered to my door at exactly the moment I needed a wife. His jaw tightened. You didn't find your way into my world by accident. You engineered it. Every step. You chose me. I chose the door you stand in front of, she said. Crane moves in your world, Damiano. The galas, the charities, the clean rooms where dirty men shake hands. I couldn't get within 100 feet of him as Eleanor Hale, but as your wife, as my wife, you could stand in any room he stands in. He finished. The cold in his eyes was absolute, now a winter with no bottom. You used me. Yes, she did not flinch from it. She had decided 2 years ago what she was willing to become, and she had become it, and she would not now pretend the cost had been smaller than it was. But here is the thing she had not planned for. The thing that had crept up on her in 4 months of quiet dinners and shared silences, and the warmth of his hand on her cheek in a ruined ballroom. The using had stopped, being only using somewhere along the way, and she had not noticed when. You should know the rest, she said quietly. Because you'll want to throw me out of this building tonight, and you have every right to, but if you do it before you hear the rest, your uncle will be dead in 3 weeks. He went very still. Crane isn't going to inherit your territory through a stroke, she said. Tommaso is being poisoned. I know the compound. I grew up in the back room of the only honest pharmacy on the south side, and I have a degree I can never use under my own name, and I am telling you that the man who is killing your uncle is the same man who killed my father, and I am the only person in this city who can prove it before it's too late. For a long moment, Damiano Ricci looked at his wife, the liar, the chemist, the ghost of a hanged man's daughter, surrounded by hundreds of photographs of her own watched face. Then, prove it, he said. Chapter 5. The work. They did not become allies. Allies trust each other. What they became was something colder and far more dangerous. 2 people pointed at the same target, each holding a knife, each aware the other might one day turn. But Damiano gave her what she needed, and what she needed was access. She needed Tommaso's blood, real samples, not the sanitized hospital panels that had been engineered to find nothing because Crane had a man inside the hospital he had to the failures were too clean. So at 3 in the morning, Damiano walked her past 2 of his own men and into the silent top floor, and she drew the blood herself with steady hands, and they ran it through a private lab in an industrial unit on the river that Damiano owned through 6 shell companies and had never once explained. She worked for 2 days without sleeping. She did not tell him exactly what she was looking for, and he did not ask, and he stood in the doorway of the lab at strange hours with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her elbow without a word, and watched her work with an expression she could not name and did not have time to. On the 3rd night, she found it. It's a metabolite, she said. Her voice was hoarse. The screen in front of her was a forest of peaks, and she touched one with a fingertip that trembled very slightly from 40 hours of caffeine and grief. The poison itself breaks down within hours. That's why the panels miss it. That's why it looks like natural decline. But it leaves a fingerprint when it breaks down. A daughter compound the body can't clear fast enough. There. She turned to him, and her eyes were burning. That's it. That's the proof. That signature is in your uncle's blood, and it does not occur in nature. And it is the patented decay product of a compound that exists in exactly one place in the world, the research division of Crane Pharmaceutical. She swallowed. It's the same family of molecule they used in 2018. The same one they hung on my father. I'd know it anywhere. I've been looking at it in my sleep for 8 years. Damiano did not move for a long moment. Can you reverse it? He said. Can you keep him alive? I can slow it. I can flush the metabolite and support his organs, and by weeks, maybe more, if I direct his care myself. She rubbed her eyes. But Damiano, the second I do that, the second his numbers start improving against all medical expectation, Crane's man inside that hospital will know someone is onto it, and Crane will stop being patient. She looked at him steadily. Patient men are predictable. He's been killing your uncle by inches because slow looks natural. The moment he knows we see him, he'll go fast. And fast means us. Then we move first, Damiano said, and for one moment, just one, the cold between them thawed, not into warmth exactly, but into something hot and shared and electric, the recognition of 2 predators discovering they hunt the same prey. He crossed the room. He stopped close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes. His hand came up. She felt the warmth of it before it arrived, and for a breathless second she thought he would touch her face the way he had in the ballroom. He didn't. His hand closed instead around the edge of the lab bench beside her. and he leaned in, and his voice was very low. "When this is finished," he said, "you and I are going to have a conversation about what you are to me. But not tonight." His eyes moved over her face like he was memorizing it. "Tonight, fix my uncle, and then help me end the man who broke us both." She did not trust herself to speak, so she only nodded and went back to the work, and did not let him see her hand shake until the door had closed behind him. The dependency formed the way water finds a crack slowly, and then all at once. It was the nights that did it. The work kept strange hours, and so did they. And somewhere in the second week, she stopped sleeping in the suite. They shared for the city's benefit and started sleeping on the narrow cot in the river lab, 3 hours at a time, surfacing to check a result and going under again. And every time she surfaced, he was there. Not hovering, Damiano Ricci did not hover, but present a dark shape at the edge of the lamplight, reading reports she would never see, making calls in a low voice in 3 languages building around her, a quiet fortress of his attention. He brought her food she forgot to eat, and then watched with something between exasperation and tenderness until she ate it. He learned to read the screens over her shoulder well enough to know when a result was bad. And on the bad nights, he said nothing at all, only set his hand flat against her back between her shoulder blades briefly, and took it away again, before either of them could decide what it meant. He started telling her things in the dark, that she suspected he had never told anyone about the stairwell, about the years before Tommaso found him, about the particular loneliness of being feared by everyone and known by no one. She told him things back. The ledger of their secrets balanced a little more each night. One night, near 3 a.m, she fell asleep at the bench mid-sentence, and woke to find he had moved her to the cot and covered her with his own coat, and was sitting against the wall a few feet away in the dark, watching the door, his gun in his lap, awake, guarding her sleep like it was the family fortune. "You should rest," she murmured. "I rest when you're safe," he said, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world, as if it had never occurred to him that there was any other arrangement. And Nora lay in the dark under the coat that smelled of him, and understood with a kind of vertigo that she was no longer using him at all, that somewhere in the river-lit dark, she had simply started belonging to him, and he to her, without either of them deciding it the way you don't decide the tide. It terrified her more than Crane ever had. She did not let him see. She closed her eyes and let him guard her, and in the morning the work went on, and neither of them said a word about the coat. But she noticed he did not ask for it back, and she noticed she did not return it. Chapter 6. The First Blood. Crane moved on a Thursday. Nora had directed 3 days of treatment by then, a quiet protocol disguised as palliative care fluids and chelation, and a dozen small corrections, and Tommaso Ricci's grey skin had begun just barely to find color again. His left hand had stopped its tremor. He had that morning asked for soup and an argument about football, and Damiano had stood at the window of the hospital room with his back to everyone, so that no one would see his face. That was the moment the man inside the hospital made his call. They came at dusk when the city was washing itself out in rain. Nora was crossing the hospital parking structure to the car, with 2 of Damiano's men flanking her, and the first thing she registered was that the men flanking her had gone tense, and the second thing she registered was the black SUV, with no plates idling on the level below. And the third thing she registered was Damiano's voice in her earpiece. Very flat, very fast. "Down. Now. Down." The garage came apart in noise. She did not remember hitting the concrete. She remembered the sound, the impossible flat hammering of it, the way the light fixtures burst overhead and rained glass, the way one of the men beside her folded without a sound. And then she remembered being covered a weight over her, a body between her and the gunfire. An arm clamped around her head, and the smell of him, cologne and rain, and underneath it, blood, and Damiano's voice in her ear saying her name, her real name. "Eleanor, Eleanor, stay down, I have you." He had come down 4 levels in an elevator with his gun already drawn. He had crossed open ground under fire to reach her. He was bleeding from a furrow the concrete had torn across his shoulder, and he did not appear to have noticed. When it was over, when his men had finished it, when the black SUV was a smoking ruin against a support pillar, and the garage was full of the wet copper smell of an ended thing, he pulled her up off the concrete and held her face in both his hands and looked at her like he was counting her, like he was making sure all of her had come through. "You're hit," she said. Her voice did not sound like hers. Her hands were on the wound on his shoulder, pressing automatic, the pharmacist's daughter taking over. "You idiot, you're bleeding, you came down into it. I will always come down into it," he said. The rain came through the open side of the garage. His blood was warm under her hands. The world had narrowed to the small lit space between their two faces. He almost kissed her. She felt the whole of him decide to felt it move through him like current, and then he stopped the way he always stopped, the way he had stopped at the lab bench. The way a man stops at the edge of a thing he cannot afford to want. "Not like this," he said roughly. "Not in the middle of blood. When I do it, it will not be because we almost died." He set his forehead against hers for one stolen second. "It will be because I chose to, the way you chose me." And then he was the boss again, all cold command, lifting her to her feet, his men closing around them, the machine of his power swallowing the chaos whole. But he kept her hand in his all the way to the car. He did not let it go. Chapter 7. The safe house. They did not go home. Home was compromised. The hospital strike meant Crane had eyes inside Damiano's own organization, a leak, a traitor. And until it was found, the penthouse was a coffin with a view. So they went north, up the storm-lashed coast of the lake, to a house Damiano owned, under no name at all. A low, dark, modern thing, built into the rocks above the water. All glass and stone. The kind of place a man builds when he wants to be, able to see anyone coming for a mile. The storm followed them up the coast and broke over the house in the dark, and they sat together in the great glass room, with the lake throwing itself against the rocks below. And for the first time since the gala, there was nothing left to do but talk. She cleaned and stitched his shoulder by the light of a single lamp. He let her. He sat very still under her hands and watched her face while she worked, and the storm pressed its black hands against the glass. And when she had finished and tied off the last stitch, he caught her wrist before she could pull away. "Tell me about him," he said. "Your father, not the file, the man." So she told him. She told him about the back room of the pharmacy that smelled of menthol and old paper. She told him about a man who filled the prescriptions of people who could not pay and never once let them feel it, who taught his daughters that a chemist holds a kind of power most people never see the power to heal or to harm, and that the whole of a person's character lived in which one they chose. She told him about the day the men in good suits came, and the headlines, and the way the neighbors stopped meeting her eyes, and the courtroom, and the holding cell, and the rope. She told him about deciding at 23 what she was willing to become. "I went underground," she said. "I changed my name. I learned to be no one, really no one, the kind of no one rich people look straight through. I took the only job that let me stand in the rooms where men like Crane go to launder themselves clean. I poured their wine and cleared their plates. And I waited Damiano. I waited 2 years for an angle, and the angle was you." She looked at him without flinching. "I'm not going to pretend it was love. It wasn't at the start. It was a door. You were a door. And now," the storm filled the silence. "Now," she said very quietly, "I stitched a bullet wound closed with my own hands tonight, and the whole time I was terrified not of the men with guns, of losing you, and I didn't plan that. It wasn't in the design. It just," her voice broke just slightly, just once. "It just happened to me, somewhere in 4 months of quiet dinners. You happened to me." He moved before she finished. He kissed her the way he had promised he would, not in blood, not in fear, but as a decision, his hand cradling the back of her skull, slow and certain and absolute a man, claiming the one thing in his cold world he had chosen freely. The storm hammered the glass. The lake threw itself against the rocks, and Nora Hale, who had built 2 years of her life out of patience and stone, came apart in the arms of the man she had used and learned to love, and let herself, for the length of a single kiss, be a person again. When they broke apart, his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady, he said, the most dangerous thing he had ever said to anyone. "Then we finish it together," he murmured. "And after you stop being no one, after the whole world learns your name." Chapter 8. The betrayal. Underneath. The betrayal. The leak had a name, and the name broke Damiano's heart a second time. It was Luca, his right hand, the man who had stood at his wedding, who had taken 3 bullets for him over 15 years, who had wept at Tommaso's bedside. Luca, who had a daughter with a disease that no honest money could treat, and to whom Victor Crane had offered, very quietly, a miracle drug and a fortune in exchange for one small thing, a pair of eyes inside the house of Ricci. They found out, because Nora found out. It was a chemist's catch. In the end, she noticed that the experimental medication Luca's daughter had begun receiving 6 months ago was a Crane compound, traced through a charity foundation that was itself a Crane shell, and she pulled the thread. The way Damiano had once pulled the thread, on her, and the whole tapestry of the betrayal came apart in her hands. Damiano went very quiet when she told him, the kind of quiet that has a body count waiting on the other side of it. He sold us to the man who is poisoning Tommaso, he said. He fed Crane the hospital schedule. He told them where you'd be in the garage. His hand closed slowly on the back of a chair until the wood complained. He let them shoot at you, or his daughter, Nora said. And then because she could not help it, because she of all people understood Damiano, he did it for his child. The same way I did everything for my father. She stepped in front of him, made him look at her. Crane does this. It's not an accident that it's always like this. He finds the thing you love most, and he turns it into the knife. He turned my father's honesty into a weapon. He turned Luca's daughter into a leash. He's been doing it for so long he thinks everyone has a price, and he thinks that's the same thing as being smart. Her eyes were burning again. That's how we beat him. Not with guns. He's expecting guns. We beat him with the one thing he's never once protected against, because he's never imagined he'd need to. And what is that, Damiano said? The truth, she said, in a room he can't buy. In front of the exact people he spends his whole life performing for. A slow, cold, terrible smile, the first real smile he had ever seen on her face. He humiliated me in front of all of Chicago, Damiano. He threw wine at the help and laughed. Let's give him back the room. They had 8 days, and they spent every one of them building a thing that could not be bought. That was the difficulty, and Damiano named it on the first night, standing over a table covered in everything Nora had assembled that Victor Crane owned in some quiet degree nearly everyone who mattered. He owned judges through their charities and journalists through their access and prosecutors through their ambitions, and a single accusation dropped into that machine would be ground to powder before it ever reached a courtroom. So, they did not build an accusation. They built something Crane had never learned to defend against, because no one had ever dared. Aim it at him, a chain of evidence so clean, so redundant, so publicly witnessed in the moment of its unveiling, that burying it would require burying half the city's cameras at once. Nora ran the science. 3 independent labs, 3 chains of custody, the 2018 tissue samples retested under court-admissible protocols by people who had never heard the name Ricci. Damiano ran the room. He could not buy the guests away from Crane, but he could make certain the right ones were present. The one prosecutor in Chicago who had built her whole career on being unpurchasable. The financial reporter Crane had blacklisted years ago and never thought to fear. The surgeon who had signed Tommaso's false death watch and could be made very gently to understand the value of confessing first. On the 7th night, when the plan was built and there was nothing left to do but wait, she found him on the terrace looking at the city he was about to set fire to. If this goes wrong, he said, without turning, you become the most exposed person in this city. Crane will know exactly who you are and exactly what you took from him, and a cornered Crane is not the patient man poisoning an old man by inches. He's the other thing. His hands tightened on the rail. I can put you somewhere safe. Tonight. A place no one finds. You give me the evidence and I finish it, and you never stand in that room at all. No. Eleanor, he looked through me my whole life, she said, coming to stand beside him. He looked through my father in a courtroom. He looked through me in a hospital corridor 4 feet away. Men like Crane built the entire world out of not seeing people like us, Damiano, and the only thing that ends a man like that is to make him look. I'm not handing that to anyone else. Not even you. She turned to face him. I didn't survive 8 years of being no one to be made safe at the finish line. He looked at her for a long moment in the gold light of the city, and she watched him want to overrule her, watched the protector in him strain against its leash, and then watched him do the hardest thing she had ever seen him do, which was to let her be dangerous. Then I stand beside you, he said. When you make him look, I'm there. The whole room sees the both of us. And anyone who decides to reach for you in that room reaches through me first. He took her face in his hands the way he had in the ballroom a lifetime ago, gentle and absolute. That's not me protecting you because you're weak. I have watched you take a poisoning apart with your bare hands and stitch a bullet out of my shoulder without blinking. I know exactly how dangerous you are. His thumb moved once across her cheek. I stand beside you because I want the man who broke us to understand in his last good moment that he didn't just fail to destroy one of us. He made the worst possible enemy twice, and then he introduced us. She kissed him then on the dark terrace with the doomed city glittering below. Not a performance, not a stolen second in the middle of blood, but a promise. And in the morning, they went to war in evening clothes. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The Crane Foundation's Spring Benefit was the social event of the season 500 of the city's most important people, under the great glass dome of the conservatory, candlelight and orchids, and an orchestra. And at the center of it all, Victor Crane, in a perfect tuxedo, beloved, celebrated, untouchable, a man being honored that very night for his lifetime of healing. Nora walked in on Damiano Ricci's arm in a gown, the color of dried blood, and this time no one looked through her. They knew her now. The wife, the mystery, the woman the most dangerous man in Chicago had claimed in front of the whole city. The room turned to watch her the way it had turned to laugh 4 weeks before, and she walked through it with her chin level and her hand light on her husband's sleeve, and she did not pour anyone's wine. Tommaso Ricci came in behind them. That was the first crack in Victor Crane's perfect night, the sight of a man he believed to be 3 weeks from a grave walking into his benefit on his own 2 feet gray, no longer sharp-eyed, alive. Crane's celebrated smile held because men like Crane have spent their whole lives learning to hold a smile, but Nora was watching his hands, and she saw the glass tremble in them just slightly, just once. She let him sweat through the dinner. She let him sweat through the speeches. She let him climb to the podium under the great glass dome to accept his award for a lifetime of healing, and that was when she stood up. "Mr. Crane," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not have to be. The room had been waiting all night for the wife to do something, and now she had, and 500 people went silent to listen. "You don't recognize me," she said, walking slowly toward the podium, the candlelight moving across the blood-dark silk of her gown. "You've looked at me twice in your life. Once 4 weeks ago when you threw a glass of wine at a waitress and laughed, and once 8 years ago when you sat across a courtroom from the man you'd chosen to destroy, and you didn't even bother to watch him break." She stopped at the foot of the podium and looked up at him, and the whole room leaned in. His name was Samuel Hale. He was a pharmacist. He was my father. And you murdered 3 people with a compound out of your own laboratory, and you let him hang for it because he was small and you were not, and you have spent your entire life believing that no one small ever comes back. Crane's smile was gone now. "This woman is unwell," he said to the room. "Security." The compound was a metabolite masking toxin, Nora said over him clearly, and now she was not speaking to Crane at all. She was speaking to the 500 most powerful people in Chicago, the bankers and the surgeons and the journalists. Every one of them recording on the phones in their 2 laps. It mimics natural decline. It breaks down in hours and leaves almost nothing behind. Almost. It leaves a daughter compound the body can't clear a chemical fingerprint that exists nowhere in nature and is the patented property of exactly one research division on the planet. Yours. She held up a slim folder. "It's in the blood of Tommaso Ricci, who refused to sell you his business in February and began to die in March. It's in the archived tissue samples from your 2018 victims, which I have had independently retested under 3 separate chains of custody this week. It is your signature, Mr. Crane. You sign everything you kill. You're just so used to no one being able to read it." The silence under the glass dome was the same silence that had filled the ballroom 4 weeks before, heavy, total, a held breath about to break. But this time it did not break around Nora. It broke around Victor Crane. "You can't," he started. And his voice cracked, and that crack was the sound of an empire coming apart, because the worst thing that can happen to a man who has bought everyone is for the room to suddenly understand that he has, and to begin doing the math on what that makes them. A senator stood up and walked out, then a judge. Then the journalists stopped pretending to be guests and became journalists. The orchestra had stopped playing. Somewhere a woman was crying. Victor Crane looked out over the conservatory at the faces of every person whose approval he had spent his whole life purchasing, and watched them all one by one decline to save him. And then he ran. Chapter 10. The Church. He ran because cornered men run, and there was a car waiting because men like Crane always have a car waiting, and for 11 minutes the city believed he might actually escape. He did not get out of the city. Damiano's people closed the bridges the way you close a fist, and Crane's driver took a wrong turn into the old industrial North End to avoid them. And that was where it ended, in the wet ruin of a deconsecrated church on the river. Its roof half open to the storm, rain pouring down through. the broken vault and pooling silver on the stone floor where an altar used to be. Nora came in out of the rain behind her husband. She had not been able to stay away. Damiano had told her to wait in the car, and she had looked at him, and he had understood the way he always understood her. Now that there were some endings a person has to witness with their own eyes or carry incomplete forever. So she stood at the back of the broken church in her blood-dark gown, with the rain coming down through the open roof, and she watched. Victor Crane was on his knees on the wet stone. He was not begging, not yet. He was still trying to buy. "Whatever Ricci is paying you," he was saying fast to the men around him, "to the dark. To anyone I will triple it, I will quadruple it, name a number." And then Damiano stepped into the light of the one working bulb, rain sheeting off his shoulders. And Crane's voice finally failed because there was no number in the world that lived in those eyes. "You poisoned the man who raised me," Damiano said quietly. "You put a bullet near my wife. You turned my oldest friend's dying daughter into a leash." He crouched down to Crane's level the way he had once crouched to a boy's eye level, the way he did. Everything deliberate, unhurried, terrible. "Do you know what I do, Mr. Crane, to men who reach for the people I love?" And here the story could have become a simple thing, a gun, a body, a closed account. Damiano had killed before. The men around him expected it. The night had earned it. The storm seemed to be asking for it. But Nora's voice came clear across the broken church. "Damiano." He went still. "If you kill him," she said, walking forward through the rain and the silver pools, "he dies as a mystery. A scandal. A man who vanished. And in 5 years there will be a documentary that wonders whether he was framed. And in 10 years there will be a foundation in his name. And somewhere out there my father will still be the pharmacist who killed 3 people. She stopped beside her husband and looked down at the man who had unmade both their lives. "I didn't spend 2 years becoming no one so that he could die a legend." Her voice was very steady. "I want him to live. I want him to stand trial, a real one, with everything I have on the record, with the whole city that worshipped him watching. I want him to spend 20 years becoming exactly what he made my father into. Small, hated, forgotten." She met Damiano's eyes. "That's not mercy. That's the worst thing we can do to him, and it's the only thing that gives my father his name back." For a long moment, the rain was the only sound. Then Damiano Ricci stood and holstered the thing he had been about to use and looked at his wife with an expression that was no longer cold at all. "You're certain," he said. "I've never been more certain of anything." "Then he's yours," Damiano said. And to his men, without turning, "He doesn't get a lawyer of his own choosing. He doesn't get a phone call to anyone who can make him disappear. He gets handed to the one prosecutor in this city neither he nor I own, with every shred of what my wife found in front of every camera in Chicago." A pause. "Let the law have him. It's the only cruelty he never bought protection from." Victor Crane began finally to beg. No one in the church listened. They had all of them in their time been people he refused to hear. Chapter 11. The Name. Spring came late to the lake that year, but it came. The trial took 11 months, and it broke Victor Crane the way he had broken so many others, not in a single dramatic stroke, but slowly by inches the way his own poisons worked. His empire stripped from him, asset by asset. His admirers, peeling away one defection at a time, until the man who had thrown wine at a waitress for sport sat alone at a defendant's table in a cheap suit, while the daughter of Samuel Hale testified against him for 3 days in a clear, unhurried, devastating voice. When the verdict came, Nora did not celebrate. She drove instead to a small cemetery on the south side in the rain, and she stood at a modest stone she had not been able to bear to visit in 8 years. And she told her father quietly that the world knew now, that his name was clean, that the small honest man had outlasted the great corrupt one after all. Damiano waited for her at the edge of the cemetery under a black umbrella, not intruding, simply there the way he had learned to be there, the way he would, she understood now, always be there. Tommaso Ricci recovered fully. He swam his mile again by summer, at the wedding. The second one, the real one, the one they held, not for a truce or a dying man's condition, but because 2 people had chosen each other with their eyes open. He stood up to give a toast and said only this: "I asked my nephew to bring me one ordinary thing to be proud of before I died." He raised his glass to the woman in white at the head of the table, the chemist, the ghost, the wife no one had seen coming. He brought me her instead, and there has never been anything ordinary about her at all. That night on the dark terrace above the lake, Damiano found his wife standing at the rail with the city throwing its gold light up at the low clouds, and he came up behind her and folded his arms around her and rested his chin against her hair. "You used me to get into this world," he murmured. "I did. And now you're stuck in it." His arms tightened. "With me. For the rest of your life." She turned in the circle of his arms and looked up at the man. The whole city feared. The man who had stood up in a ballroom for a woman. Everyone else had laughed at the man who had crouched in a broken church and chosen her justice over his own rage. And she smiled. The slow, real smile that she now gave only to him. "Good," she said. Below them, the lake moved against the rocks in the dark, patient, and endless the way she had once been patient, the way she did not have to be anymore. He kissed her under the gold-lit clouds, and somewhere in the city, a man who had believed everyone had a price was learning very slowly, by inches, exactly what it costs to look through the wrong woman. They never did find out how Damiano's grandfather built the family in the first place, but that, as Tommaso liked to say, is a different story entirely. And in a world like theirs, there is always a different story waiting in the next dark room behind the next closed door. The end. And that is where we leave them, on a dark terrace above the water. The woman who was once invisible now standing beside the man who would burn the whole world down before he'd ever look away from her again. She poured their wine for 2 years. And in the end, the entire city learned her name. Beat. If this story gave you chills, if you felt it the moment Damiano rose from that chair in the silence, if Nora's reckoning under the glass dome made you want to stand up and cheer, then do one small thing for me right now. Tap that like button. It takes 1 second. It tells me to keep these stories coming. And it helps another reader who loves dark romance find this channel tonight. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on the bell. Every week I bring you a brand new Mafia boss love story. A new woman the world overlooked. A new dangerous man who is the first to truly see her. And a new ending that makes everyone who doubted her live to regret it. Now I want to hear from you down in the comments. Did you see the twist coming, that she engineered the marriage all along? And the big one, should Damiano have let Crane walk out of that church alive? Or should Nora have let him pull the trigger? Tell me what you would have done. Most important, you decide what I write next. Here are 3 stories I'm choosing between for the next video. Drop the number in the comments and the most requested one goes live first. The night shift nurse who saved the wrong man's life on a rainy table, and the mafia boss who decided she belonged to him before she ever opened her eyes. The runaway bride who climbed into a stranger's black SUV to escape her own wedding, never knowing the stranger was the most feared man in the city. The quiet seamstress in the mansion with a blade sewn into her sleeve, sent to kill the boss, who became the only man who ever truly saw her. Comment 1, 2, or 3 and whichever wins I write next. If you made it all the way to the end, you're my kind of person. Share this with the friend you always text about your favorite dark romance, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay dangerous.